Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Wednesday, November 19th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, if a cyber attack hits, breakdowns inside the organization may be as dangerous as the hackers themselves. Plus, when the hotspots go dark, who connects the unconnected? Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Federal Communications Commission is set to reverse cybersecurity rules for telecommunications providers. The commission will meet Thursday to rescind requirements that were put in place following the Salt Typhoon hacks. For more, Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me now. Justin, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
So let's set the stage. What exactly are these cybersecurity rules that the FCC wants to remove?
Well, these rules were put in place in the final days of the Biden administration back in January. The FCC at that time had adopted a new ruling that did require telecom operators to secure their networks under a law called the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act. And essentially, this was in response to the Salt Typhoon hack into telecom providers that came to light last year. It was a sweeping hack that swept up networks across the world, and it allowed Chinese government-sponsored hackers to essentially spy on government figures, on political figures, to include then-candidate Donald Trump. And so this was really a devastating hack, and the FCC adopted these rules back in January. But now, under the new Republican leadership at the FCC, they argue these rules are not an agile and collaborative approach to cybersecurity, and that the rules actually exceeded the FCC's authorities. And so they will meet on Thursday to rescind these rules, and they essentially have the Republican leadership in place to do that Thursday.
Once they pull these rules back, what fills the vacuum? Do they have a new plan to address telecom cybersecurity?
Well, the FCC is saying that now under this new leadership that they want to pursue an agile and collaborative approach to cybersecurity through federal-private partnerships. And they've also pointed to steps that the FCC has already taken to collaborate with the telecom sector on Salt Typhoon specifically, in terms of investigating those incidents, in terms of releasing public information about the threat of Salt Typhoon and steps to mitigate those vulnerabilities, and as well as steps that the telecom providers have said they've taken to better secure their networks going forward.
So the businesses are already in the business of complying with these rules. What are some of the changes that the companies have put in place themselves?
Well, they've said that they've done several things in the wake of Salt Typhoon. There was a letter that essentially the lawyers for several telecom associations sent to the FCC back in October asking them to repeal these rules. And they pointed to the fact that telecom providers have already done things like accelerated patching cycles. They've updated and reviewed access controls for critical systems. They've enhanced threat hunting activities. There are a number of steps that they list in this letter that they say the telecom providers have taken on a voluntary basis and under this ruling back in January. And they argue that the ruling should be done away with, and a proposed rule to kind of bake these cybersecurity requirements into effect in the future should also be done away with, because they've already taken these steps under a largely voluntary basis.
What about the agencies? Have they also had to take action regarding the Salt Typhoon hacks?
Well, the agencies like the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and the FBI have been intimately involved in investigating these attacks and in terms of releasing public guidance about these hacks. They do not regulate necessarily the cybersecurity of the telecom sector writ large. The FCC actually hasn't really done that until these January rules, but that just goes to show you how devastating of an attack this Salt Typhoon hack was. Is they took this kind of unprecedented step to regulate cybersecurity much more directly with the telecom sector. But the agencies have been working with the sector under the kind of public-private partnership model that has existed for decades. And now in recent years, of course, we've seen this back and forth between deepening those partnerships and then moving to regulations in some cases because of just the kind of urgent and increasing level of cyber attacks that have hit critical infrastructure.
Is there any interest from the members of Congress to do anything legislatively to solve this problem?
Well, there's a couple things to mention there. One is that Congress has passed a law back several years ago now, the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act. And CISA is in charge of writing those rules. They've written the rules already, but they have not finalized them, and they are supposed to do that at some point next year. So that will require critical infrastructure sectors, including telecom sectors, to report cyber attacks to the government. The other thing Congress has done recently, actually just this week, is passed a bill that would establish a joint interagency task force to specifically address China-linked cyber threats, which we've covered a lot on this program in terms of Salt Typhoon, Vault Typhoon, and attacks on critical infrastructure emanating from Chinese-sponsored groups. So that bill passed the House on Monday. It would establish a task force led by CISA. We'll see what the Senate does with it going forward.
It seems like there's a cybersecurity attack every day, and it moves so quickly. Is this voluntary public-private partnership structure going to be enough to be responsive or proactive to the threats?
That is the million-dollar question, I think. The Biden administration, their cybersecurity strategy sought to establish minimum standards for cybersecurity across critical infrastructure. In some cases, they were able to actually get those in place in places like the transportation and rail sector. In other sectors like telecom, like healthcare, like energy, it's been a little bit more difficult to adopt those minimum cybersecurity regulations because there's just a lot of back and forth between government and industry on what's acceptable as far as a cyber regulation, what's the proper standard of care for cybersecurity. That's still an evolving conversation. It'll be interesting to see the Trump administration with its more deregulatory focus to see how they kind of thread that needle with seeing the need to establish some sort of minimum cybersecurity standards one way or another in critical infrastructure.
That's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, thanks for bringing us this story.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find the full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, when the hotspots go dark, who connects the unconnected? This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. A recent decision from the FCC has the nation's public libraries concerned. It had to do with a program aimed at providing publicly available high-speed broadband internet, particularly in rural areas. However, a recent vote by the FCC ends its support of the program. To understand how public libraries will look to adjust, Federal News Network's Eric White spoke with Sam Helmick, president of the American Libraries Association.
Sam, welcome.
Thank you, Eric. It's wonderful to be with you today.
Of course, it's wonderful to have you. So help us understand the program we're discussing here is the E-Rate Hotspot Lending Program. Tell us a little bit about that, and then we can kind of get into what happened here.
Oh, thank you, Eric. So the E-Rate Hotspot Lending Program is built on, I'd say, about 3 decades of the FCC's E-Rate program, which has enabled libraries and schools to have discounts for broadband connectivity as we continue to develop 21st century readers, learners, and skills. And so traditionally that E-rate funding could only be used for connections with libraries and school buildings, but then in 2024, the then FCC chairwoman really launched this beautiful program called Learn Without Limits. And that expanded eligibility for the Wi-Fi hotspot devices that libraries could retain to be circulated much like books, particularly to households without reliable or affordable broadband. And the American Libraries Association deeply supported this. And it was executed at more than 800 libraries across the nation. School and public have utilized this service. It's about $34 million worth of hotspots funding in the year of 2025 to make meaningful connectivity change for Americans.
Okay, got it. So the FCC voted to virtually end the program back on September 30th. What happened there? What was their reasoning for giving that? And does that truly mean the end of the program, or are there other avenues that the program could take to stay alive?
You're absolutely right. On September 30th of this year, the FCC voted 2-1 to rescind the hotspot lending program and the school bus Wi-Fi initiative. The majority argued that the E-rate statute didn't authorize funding for services used beyond library and school property. But the American Library Association, along with many of our partner organizations, disagree with that interpretation and have really urged the FCC to reconsider and maintain the program. This decision reversal rules adopted in 2024 that have just begun to take effect, and we're already sort of seeing like the 2025 E-rate cycle being denied. And we understand that a reader denied is literacy denied, and connectivity denied is almost like participation in civic and educational life denied.
Yeah, particularly in those rural areas where you may not have a steady connection, and you can still obviously access the internet in the library, but when you're in a teaching scenario and you don't want to take up the computer for too long because then you start to feel guilty, right? So what other options do folks have who are out in those rural areas that relied on this program?
Right. If the federal government isn't prepared to create a robust infrastructure for broadband for our national security, entrepreneurial and economic development, and then just, pursuit of educational wellness and happiness, then I think that we have to think about those students that are on bus rides for up to like 3 hours a day back and forth trying to accomplish their homework, or folks who are applying for jobs on Sundays because it's the only day they have off, but the library isn't supported or resourced enough to be open to them for their public access computers. But then also folks who are trying to attend telehealth appointments, access government services, or even connect with loved ones. Often I think folks forget that libraries are spaces where during both triumph and trials in a community, this is where folks need to go to access internet to tell the broader world and their loved ones that they're safe and they're fine. And so we're really thinking about the broad spectrum of American life and how the lack of connectivity infrastructurally has been devastating. And this was a effort to mitigate that devastation, and now to lose this really leaves a lot of Americans in the lurch.
We're speaking with Sam Helmick, president of the American Libraries Association. Let's talk about federal support for public libraries in general. I've spoken to your organization in the past. There were some concerns about dwindling support, and obviously cuts have come across the board for a lot of federal programs, and I'm sure that libraries are not immune to that. Do I have that correct? And where do things currently stand?
Oh, you're absolutely right. In 2024, the Institute of Museum and Library Services awarded $266.7 million through grant-making, research, and policy development that particularly supported not only our state libraries across the nation, but then our small and rural that rely on those matching state dollar funds to make sure that our tax dollars are working twice and three times over. So with the executive order seeking to dismantle that institute, as well as the lack of robust or comprehensive release of the congressionally mandated funds that fund that institute, that support libraries around the country and therefore communities around the country, libraries are experiencing resource scarcity at the federal and then the state and then at the local level, because despite the fact that those federal dollars have been paid by the taxpayers, they're not getting returned back. And then if you have contracts through those state consortiums or state libraries, those contracts didn't end just because the congressionally mandated dollars were not provided to the states. And so this is creating an undue burden on state taxes and taxpayers. And then that trickles down to hurting rural communities that are the least resourced, but probably like the most in need when it comes to their community anchor institutions, which are a public or a school or an academic library.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm in no way living in a rural area, but going to any of the libraries in my vicinity, they're as crowded as ever. So it seems as if the need for resources is almost at an all-time high at a time when they may not have all the support they need.
I agree with you, Eric. Increasingly, you and I understand that having digital connection is going to allow us to not only thrive civically, but economically, educationally, and then just socially. And so to bar that access to any American, particularly in a country that is so well resourced and rich, feels counterintuitive to ensuring that we continue to be a nation that thrives 250 years into our story.
All right, so the situation is what it is. What steps are organizations like yourselves taking? And, are there other options on the table, nonprofits, things of that nature? Or is it really just going to come down to more states and more local governments are going to have to step in if they want to save these libraries?
Right. So I think it's holding anybody, regardless of where they sit on the aisle, accountable to understanding that more Americans visit libraries than they do baseball games, which is our national pastime, and that 70% of us are not interested in abridging or censoring information for any reason, not for economic reasons, not for ideological reasons. That's a large spectrum of American life through third-party surveys that show us how much we value access to information. So how do we support those values? Well, first, we recognize that we're about to be 250 years old as a nation, and that this unique form of government had an essential mechanism called libraries, which is why a lot of our founders invested in them, because they wanted a robust constituency in society that was educated so that it could progress and have informed decisions when it came to civic life. And if we're going to continue to value that, that means we need to use our libraries. We need to dust off our library cards and make sure that they're active increasingly and regularly. As folks who want to get into the advocacy piece, it's visiting ala.org/advocacy to learn how you can write an email, invite your Congress member to come visit their local libraries in their areas of representation, join a city council, join a library board of trustees, join a school board so that your voice and fingerprints are part of the conversation. It's writing to your legislators and reminding them that you wanted to robustly support your libraries, and so you're asking them to write policy and create funding that will make that manifest. And then lastly, you can also visit ilovelibraries.org so that if you're wanting to support the American Library Association and library practitioners that are doing this work, you can donate your story, you can donate funds to support moving this national value 250 years into the future.
You bring up the 250 years portion, and that provides me a nice segue. Your organization is 150 years old almost. From a historical standpoint, have the nation's libraries ever really gone through anything like this before? I'm just curious if you have any historical perspective on if we've been here before, through tumultuous times that throughout American history.
Great opportunity to tell a story. I love telling stories, Eric. In 1938, Des Moines Public Library Director Forrest Spalding wrote the Library of Bill of Rights, and I think he did it for a few reasons. We had just gone through a Great Depression and recognized how instrumental our libraries were to supporting their communities during economic strife, but also lifting them up to build entrepreneurial and economic development. But then it was also like going through between the world wars and recognizing that we were a melting pot, and sometimes the ideas and values of a very vibrant culture, they blend and harmonize, but sometimes they also brush and create friction. And so creating a set of values where it talks about the right to use reading rooms, the right to find books that both counter and support your own ideology, the right to assemble, the right to speak and to read were essential. And in 1939, the American Library Association adopted that to become an international of free people reading freely. And so when I think about our history, I think libraries have been very good at growing at the pace of their societies, turning inwardly to think about how they can do the work better, and then relying on their communities to do the work best. And so while I would argue that we probably are seeing a difficult time, probably something that even counters McCarthyism in the United States, we have always turned in and relied on our communities and our values to push through. And so using your library, visiting ala.org/advocacy, using your voice to speak to those that you've elected into power, this has always been the recipe. And if we all stay in character, I think we can continue to thrive.
Sam Helmick is president of the American Library Association. Thank you so much for joining us.
It was my honor. Thank you, Eric.
And you can find this interview along with more information at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.
Still to come, from small business roots to mid-tier powerhouse, this firm is using employee ownership and AI to stay ahead in federal contracting. But first, if a cyber attack hits, breakdowns inside the organization may be as dangerous as the hackers themselves. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. New data from Cytactic shows that 70% of security leaders say internal misalignment creates more disruption than the threat actor itself. From unrehearsed plans to unclear authority, organizations are struggling to respond effectively even with strong tech in place. Josh Ferenzi, head of strategy at Cytactic, explains what leaders should do now to close the readiness gap. Mr. Ferenzi, thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Cytactic has just published a report, The State of Cybersecurity Incidents Response Management. Let's start with the headline. 70% of cybersecurity leaders say internal misalignment causes more chaos than the hackers themselves. Tell us what that means. What kind of misalignment? What kind of incidents? Why is that the most surprising finding of your report?
Absolutely. I'd love to. So first of all, let's just appreciate the finding. I think it's absolutely stunning to hear from practitioners who say that misalignment is much more concerning and creates much more of the chaos or disruption than the threat actors themselves. I think that the security industry broadly is familiar with the concept of FUD, right? Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And there's so much focus on these threat actors. And there's a cost to that, and the cost is that we forget about our own people. And when we see that there's misalignment, actually misalignment is the core issue, it strikes home the idea that people, it returns us to people. And there are three different ways I want to take that. The first one is that culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? It's a famous quote that we've heard, and it really focuses us around our people. Understanding that in an incident, when you're managing an incident, there are going to be different stakeholders involved. Right? It's not just going to be a security function investigating the incident. You're also going to have legal teams who are evaluating disclosure obligations, contractual requirements for service agreements, and different other legal requirements. There will be IT and operation teams who are focused on restoring operations, bringing backups live, doing IT and ops work. You're going to have PR and communication teams who are focused on the narrative, on the reputation, on interacting with the public and the press. And so you end up having all of these different teams and all of these different stakeholders who have to work together. And for most organizations, it might be the first time that these people are working together. It's not a part of their day-to-day routine for the general counsel and the CISO or the VP of communications to work with the head of IT. And all of a sudden they have to. And not only do they have to work together, in an environment or a workspace that they're not accustomed to working together, but there's this incredible amount of urgency and this intense pressure in the room, in the office, in the organization because of the incident itself. And all of that sort of joins together to cause this recipe for misalignment and for chaos. And what that ends up looking like is teams or squads are formed to respond to a particular event, and it's chaotic or it's misaligned because they've never worked together. Another aspect of it is they speak different languages. There's this emphasis on language being very different. For example, the CISO and the security team may use terminology like TTPs, which are tactics, techniques, and procedures. They may be using language like IOCs, which are indicators of compromise. And this language is foreign to people on the legal team who maybe think of things as evidence instead of IOCs, or think about materiality instead of impact. And you can run the gamut across all of these different stakeholders using different language. And all of a sudden you're caught in this Tower of Babel, essentially, scenario where all of these different teams have to work together to get to the top, but we speak different languages. So the first one is people. They're not used to working together. They don't know each other. The second one is they use different languages, so they can't get on the same page, furthering the misalignment or the chaos. And the third one is really decision authority. It's the first time that the organization is going to take some of these decisions. These aren't decisions that they're used to. For example, should we bring down the IT system in question in order to begin an investigation on the system? Or should we keep the system running as business as usual in order to keep operations running? So that's an interesting trade-off. Because on the one hand, if I bring the system down, I can cause business damages. In a sense, I alert my customers or my supply chain that a system is no longer available. But on the other hand, I want to investigate the system. I need to find out what's happening. So there are all these tricky decisions, and it's not really clear inside an organization whether or not they know who takes these decisions. What's the right process for taking the decision? Who is the ultimate decisor? What checks or what considerations do we need to take with other teams before we take the decision? And that also creates a lot of misalignment and chaos. So in a sense, it's people, it's language, and it's decisions.
It's a really helpful framing. I'm speaking with Josh Ferenzi. He's the head of the Innovation Lab at Cytactic. One of the other features that caught my eye is that most of these companies and government agencies have cyber incidents response plans, but those response plans go out the window almost immediately. And in the military, we used to have a saying that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. What are you finding here in terms of how agencies and companies can use that response plan and actually leverage it, as opposed to saying, oh, well, we had a plan, but now we have to do something different?
Oh, great question. It actually reminds me of a Mike Tyson quote that says, everyone has a plan till they get punched in the face.
Same idea.
Right? And exactly, it's the same idea, and incident response is very much like that. Some organizations have incident response plans, but there are several problems with their plans. The first problem we encounter is that their incident response plan is usually on paper. It's a paper document. And this file, whether or not it's printed as a backup copy, is very difficult to use during the incident. It's very difficult to flip through these pages. What pages are relevant for this team? What pages are relevant for that team? Another issue, so it's not dynamic. It's basically a very difficult tool to use during response. The second issue with traditional incident response plans is that most of the time, it hasn't really been worked on for a large span of time before the incident. Maybe the plan was prepared a year ago, it was prepared 6 months ago, the person who prepared it is no longer here with us at the organization, they haven't updated it, they're using an old version, so it's not continuously being refreshed or tuned for the organization. That's a second issue with traditional incident response plans. And a third issue that incident response plans have is that they're static. So you have a plan for what you've prepared it for, but most of the time, the incident looks different. The incident looks unique. It has its own traits. And the plan you've prepared is not prepared for this incident. So what ends up happening is teams quickly lose faith or they lose trust in the plan itself. They toss it to the side and they start improvising. And you don't really want to be in a room with a bunch of executives who are improvising for the first time under a tremendous amount of urgency, right? So traditional incident response plans are scoured with issues. And part of what organizations need is a technological system, something that is dynamic, something that is adaptive, something that is able to receive information and change the plan as it goes, much like a consultant would do with you in the room, right? You would sort of aggregate the facts of the situation, you'd share them with an advisor, and you'd ask the advisor to share advice on what to do next. And as information changes, of course, the advisor's guidance is going to change. It doesn't stay the same. And that's what we need with our plans. We need our plans to be able to change as the incident unfolds. One of the challenging parts of managing incident response is that information kind of trickles in day by day. You don't have the full picture on day one. And what do you do to respond when you only have part of the picture? You only have part of the information. And every day or every week, you unfold more and more of this information. So you need a plan that's able to guide your team, that's able to bring these stakeholders together, that's able to orchestrate people who don't speak the same language in a dynamic fashion.
For government leaders who are just turning in to our conversation, what's one thing about this report that should change how they think about cyber incident planning, like starting immediately?
Sure. So the first thing I would say is that organizations would really benefit from deciding, in a sense. It's taking the decision of who is going to be my team when we respond to an incident, and getting this team familiar with themselves, with each other. Many times we sort of organizations rush into a tabletop exercise, sort of a scenario, and let's see how we manage this scenario. But I would take a step before that, just to get the team used to each other. introductions, make it, if you can, make some cadence of touch points between them throughout the year so that they regain familiarity with each other and their working methods. I think this is number one. It's essentially build your team and get your team familiar with one another. The second thing they can do from a point of readiness is begin to assign those team members their roles and their responsibilities in the incident itself. So you can start to think about what are going to be, let's say, the top 2 or 3 action items for each of these team members. They should know that they will be the ones responsible for these action items, and they should be able to know who they need to consult with. Who do they need to work with for those action items? So first, I would say build your team, get your team familiar with each other. Second, I would say assign roles and responsibilities. And at that point is when I would begin to open the situation up to, okay, now that we have the team and we have our roles and responsibilities, what are those key scenarios that we need to be prepared for? Because those key scenarios have an outsized impact on our work or our ability to do what we're supposed to do. And what that does is all of a sudden it turns our readiness or our tabletop exercise into something that's risk-tuned, into something that's specific to what I consider important. And if you get those 3 things together, I think it's a great start to your readiness.
I've been speaking with Josh Ferenzi. He's head of the Innovation Lab at Cytactic. Thank you so much for the really clear perspective on places where we all need to bulk up and improve.
It was my pleasure, Terry. I'd be happy to come back whenever the invite's available.
Indeed. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, from small business roots to mid-tier powerhouse, this firm is using employee ownership and AI to stay ahead in federal contracting. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Salex started as a small business with big ambitions. Today, it's a mid-market federal contractor betting on innovation, agility, and shared ownership to thrive in a fast-changing government landscape. Chairman and CEO Travis Mack shares how the company scaled up and why an AI-first culture is central to its future in this episode of Government Contractors to Watch, sponsored by J.P. Morgan Chase. Travis, thanks for joining me.
I'm excited to be here.
Salex has come a long way from when you founded it as a small business 25 years ago. Was there a turning point or an innovation in your journey that really helped you deliver more value to federal customers?
Well, over the years, growing a small business is kind of an iterative process. And you learn a lot of things along the way. And, we had done very well in the small business vertical. But when we got to that point where we were trying to make that inflection, that turn to trying to be a large business, there were a couple things that we were considering. Were we going to remain a small business or were we just going to blow right through it? And we decided to kind of blow right through the small business threshold. And with that, we had to do a few things differently. We certainly had to upgrade our talent, which was really important, right? And we had to also look at trying to drive additional revenue streams, trying to create additional value for the federal government. And so we decided on not only were we going to grow organically, we were going to grow inorganically as well, which kind of led to our strategy of mergers and acquisitions and incorporating that into our organic growth.
Well, as you say, growing past that small business to large business zone can be really, really challenging. But you've kept Salex as an employee-owned company. Yes. How did that decision factor in to your growth strategy?
Well, great question. And it factored in because as we were making the transition, we had to figure out how were we going to attract the best and the brightest. And it was actually one of our core strategic decisions on us trying to go and become a large business. And it has been the kind of the pillar of us trying to grow. So us becoming and transitioning into an employee-owned organization was really something that I thought of. And I said to myself, you know what? If you were going to be asked to work 80, 90 hours a week, what would you want, Travis? I said, I'd probably want equity. And hence, the employee-owned building blocks that we utilize today in order to attract the best and the brightest for Salex.
Is that a strategy that you think is sustainable as you continue to grow the company?
Absolutely. We've seen it demonstrated before. We think it's an excellent strategy for us to continue to scale. And for those who are willing to put in that work, put in that extra effort, we think it's something that, because it's not only, the top of the spectrum that's gaining, it's the entire organization, because everyone at Salex has equity. And, we want that, we want that community.
So you mentioned a little bit about your growth through acquisition strategy.
Sure.
So you're clearly not trying to blend in. You really want to set yourself apart. How do you set yourself apart from the other big primes in the defense and federal space?
Sure. Well, we think it's part of certainly, being an ESOP, having an equity component. We also think it's from us being unique. We've really embraced automation. We've really embraced AI. We've really embraced security in order to give ourselves a differentiating feel to the organization. And so we think at our size, being agile than maybe some of the larger primes, being more efficient than maybe some of the larger primes, and really just trying to understand what the core problem is and then solving for that. We think that is a differentiating vertical for us, and we've leaned into that. So, we're an AI-first organization, building in automation and AI through every single business system, every single component, and then that efficiency, that effectiveness really translates very seamlessly to the federal customer.
So that strategy through mergers and acquisitions can really shake up company culture as you're bringing in different organizations. How have you managed to build an organic Salex culture and hold on to that through that growth cycle?
It's a process, and it takes time. It really does, especially now with all the new changes. With how do you implement artificial intelligence efficiently? Bringing in different organizations within one culture. We've launched an initiative called One Salex, really just trying to focus everyone on it's one infrastructure, which is backed by an AI-first mindset, and bringing everybody in and just trying to demonstrate the efficiencies of the platform and how we are supporting our end customers. So we take it day by day. We try to talk about what the benefits are, and it's a lot of training, Terry. It is truly a lot of training and a lot of, I kid every single day. Half of my battle is changing hearts and minds. And I got to show up every day, changing hearts and minds and showing the innovation and showing how, at the end of the day, it's actually better.
And you're bringing in folks with some really amazing technical talent, clearance capability, high-tech roles. How are you finding the job market? And then how do you find the integration once you get them on board?
Yeah, well, the job market right now is something that we focus a lot on, right? The lifeblood of what we do is with individuals, with people. And true enough, we're trying to scale that with AI and things of that nature. But, really, it's about us being out there in the community. It's about us being active. It's about us defining and identifying roles that, we can fit individuals into very, very seamlessly. I think we've been certainly very, very forward-leaning with, the mechanisms by which we hire. Traditional ways of hiring isn't necessarily something that is at the top of the mind these days. So we try to be flexible, we try to be nimble, we try to be innovative, we try to do all those things that we think will entice individuals to come and work with Salex.
And one of those things, as you already mentioned, is being an AI-first company. So how do you deploy that kind of fast-moving technology both in Salex and then for your customers to keep them on the cutting edge?
Well, we're not going out building large language models for the federal government. That's not what we're doing. We're going to let them handle that. Ours had to be from a services perspective, right? And so we had to figure out how do we engage and utilize AI from a services perspective. So first, we thought about, hey, okay, what does that look like? So our journey with AI actually started about two years ago, and where we really started to focus on AI functionality within all of our business systems. We took that and then we put in the digital connectors with RPA, with robotic process automation. You got to have that digital connection. And then at the end of the day, trying to deploy that, from a federal perspective and integrating that with the customers and the uses and creating digital workforce agents and the whole 9 yards. And so we've tried to be innovative. We think that utilizing AI gives us an agile advantage, than some of the larger competitors that we have. We're able to move a little bit quicker as a mid-market federal contractor. And so we're excited about, what are those new use cases? What are those new concepts that we're delivering? We're thinking about the work differently, Terry, every single day. And that requires a total mind shift.
Well, speaking about thinking about the work differently, we've talked about your growth strategy. We've talked about your workforce culture and training. We've talked about your tech approach.
Sure.
But the world of federal contracting and defense contracting is changing very, very rapidly. So as you look forward, say, 5 years, what do you see for SAILEX, and how are you positioning them to take advantage of the opportunities you see?
I think that's a great question, and I'm going to try to pull out my magic ball here, my Nostradamus hat, put my Nostradamus hat on. Difficult question because of how fast things are changing, and what we're trying to do is just be iterative. What we don't want to be, Terry, is late. That is the thing. And we know we're going to have some false starts. We know we're going to not get it right as we implement automation and AI and efficiency throughout the organization. So, government agencies right now want speed, they want agility, they want efficiency, they want security, the whole 9 yards, as they are trying to change how they do the work as well. So 5 years out, we really think that it is about the iterative process. It is about changing how we do the work. It's about identifying where we can drive efficiencies. And it's about how we can, in my thoughts, do more with less, honestly, because that's where we're headed to. So we're excited about building an infrastructure, building a capability that the federal government and government agencies can utilize with some of our technical services, right? We're supplying software development, we're doing test range management, a whole bunch of technical stuff with the Department of War. So we're excited about how do we deliver those services differently, and what does that look like? Because I think that's what everyone is struggling with. What does that look like? And so we're trying to help get some visibility, and we know it's iterative. We know it's going to innovate. We know it's going to, continue to expand. But we just didn't want to be late.
That's a great motto.
Travis Mack is Chairman and CEO of SAILEX, and this has been Government Contractors to Watch, sponsored by J.P. Morgan Chase. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search J.P. Morgan Chase. A bipartisan bill that would end the Trump administration's rollback of collective bargaining rights for most federal employees is guaranteed to get a full House vote. Now that the majority of lawmakers support it, a group of 218 lawmakers have signed on to a discharge petition that would force a floor vote. A Republican lawmaker co-sponsored the bill, and 2 other Republican lawmakers helped get this bill moving. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman is here with more. Jory, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Terry. Great to be here.
Hey, let's just take a step back for a minute and review the Trump administration's actions regarding collective bargaining rights in the federal workforce. What has stood out so far?
Sure. So back in March, which was quite some time ago, the Trump administration put out this executive order stating that for a broad swath of the federal workforce, a lot of agencies were no longer going to collectively bargain with federal employee unions, pointing to this exemption that has always been on the books, that collective bargaining can't be around for agencies that primarily have a national security mission. That's been the case, and they are saying that actually that exemption applies to a lot more agencies than has previously been the case. And so they dramatically expanded that to include a lot of the federal workforce. Lawmakers estimate it's about 67% of federal employees in total. It covers the Departments of Defense, State, Veterans Affairs, Justice Department, Energy, and so many others.
So what would this bill that we've mentioned actually do with respect to collective bargaining, and how did the bill get this far in the Republican-controlled House?
So this bill, quite simply, would reverse the Trump administration's policy on this, would bring back the status quo of what federal employee unions were able to do in terms of collective bargaining before the Trump administration set this policy in motion. And so we've seen something pretty striking here. Republicans in the House have played a really key role in making sure that this legislation has gotten this far. It is co-sponsored by Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick, a Republican from Pennsylvania, someone who has in the past consistently led federal employee type issues. He has been a co-sponsor on legislation that has been relevant to the federal workforce. So that's been consistently something we've seen from him. We also saw two Republican lawmakers from New York be the decisive votes that got this discharge petition to the 218 votes necessary to force a vote. These are Congressmen Mike Lawler and Nick LaLota. They helped make sure this bill got to where it is and ensuring that it will move forward in the House.
What's been the White House reaction to moving the discharge petition forward?
We haven't heard from the White House just yet on this, but we have heard from AFGE, the American Federation of Government Employees, one of the many unions that have fought this in the courts. It's worth pointing out that they have they've had some setbacks with that. They initially heard from a federal district court judge that ruled in favor of them, but then an appeals court, as we've seen so many times, stepped in and said actually the Trump administration can proceed with this rollback of collective bargaining rights, and that's the latest chapter on that legal saga. AFGE President Everett Kelly spoke positively of these Republican lawmakers being these decisive votes, something you don't see every day, and really urging the House to, now that this discharge petition has been signed, really going quickly to a House floor vote.
Are there other actions beyond legislation that are challenging the rollback of collective bargaining?
So I mentioned that AFGE-led lawsuit. They were one of about 6 federal employee unions leading that primary lawsuit against so much of the agencies that have been rolling back collective bargaining rights. Other unions have stepped in as well. The National Treasury Employees Union has its own lawsuit on this matter as well. And also the National Weather Service Employees Organization and the Patent Office Professional Association. They represent components of the Commerce Department's workforce, and they probably have the most unusual argument here, where they're all saying that these agencies don't really have a national security mission, but the National Weather Service and the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, people don't typically think of these as national security agencies. Agencies in these proceedings said that the National Weather Service does provide weather data to the Defense Department, but the association says that's true, but they give that data to a lot of other people, and that doesn't necessarily make them a national security agency. And same thing for the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Some of the patents they review have a national security component to them. They are not, publicly available, but that is such a small fraction of the overall patents that they review, and they say that doesn't make them a national security agency by default.
Well, discharge petitions seem to be having a moment right now. What do you think is next for this one?
Yeah, so we should expect to see a vote on the House floor fairly soon on this. The whole point of the discharge petition is that it expedites the whole process, right? It doesn't fall on the House Speaker to schedule that vote, as is the case for so many other bills. The party in charge is typically the one that sets the legislative priorities of what gets voted on when. This allows the bill to kind of cut the line and get to a floor vote fairly soon, so something to look out for there.
That's Federal News Network's Jory Heckman. Jory, thanks for keeping us posted.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editors are Daisy Thornton and Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.